As a disclaimer, please be very polite to this commenter. I've seen her comment on other ex-Mormons videos, and even when she disagrees, she's always very civil. And her argument here is that when people call the church a cult, it just makes her roll her eyes, and it's kind of annoying for her because she thinks that these people are assuming that she hasn't done her own research and just come to a different conclusion based on the same information. And while I can understand why that would feel very invalidating, what you have to understand is that people assuming you haven't done your own digging into church history, that you haven't really researched it, is a very kind assumption. Because the alternative is that you looked at the sex trafficking that the early missionaries did in Europe, bringing home these poor teenage girls to marry off to old men as basically sex slaves in polygamous marriages that they did not sign up for and that we're told did not exist before they came over. You saw the sex trafficking and you were like, that's not a deal breaker. If you did your own research, then you saw that many of the early prophets, not just Joseph, were having sexual relations with children, in some cases impregnating them, often against their will and under coercive threat from God for not only their salvation, but sometimes also the salvation of their entire families. They were told that was being put at risk if they wouldn't have sex as children with these old men. To anyone who's done their digging and stayed in the church, that wasn't a deal breaker. And then when you saw Brigham Young's racism and his call for white people who marry black people to be murdered, you saw that racism and you went, that's not a deal breaker. When you read about the murder by the saints of indigenous peoples of Utah, you went, not a deal breaker. If you did your digging, then you saw that we know Joseph Smith thoroughly lied about the translation concerning the Kinderhook plates, which were clearly a fraud meant to catch him in a lie, and they did so successfully. You read about the Book of Abraham, and you know that he lied about translating it. And for you, that wasn't a deal breaker. It means you learned that not only were blacks not allowed to have the priesthood until the late 70s, but they weren't even allowed to be sealed to their children, and were sometimes sealed as eternal servants to white people. Do you know what unpaid servitude is? It's a very fancy, lawyer-approved way for the church to be able to say that they were sealed as slaves. You found out that slaves were accepted as a form of tithing in some cases, and you thought, that's not a deal breaker. So if you're a member of the church and you're like, this is so invalidating that people don't just think I've done my own research and come to a different conclusion, what you have to realize is that when people assume you haven't done your own digging, it's a very kind assumption because the alternative is quite gruesome. It means you learned about the torture, the church-approved torture of gay people in conversion therapy in the BYU, and you were just like, that's fine, not a deal breaker.